My name is Ethan Walker. I was 22 years old when the world ended. And I need to say that up front because everything I'm about to describe happened to someone who had not yet finished a degree in molecular biology, who had never fired a weapon, who had never watched someone die. I was not prepared. None of us were prepared. But preparation, I've learned, is mostly a story people tell themselves before the thing happens. And then the thing happens. And you discover that what you actually needed was something no curriculum offers. I was a fourth-year student at Whetstone University in central Pennsylvania. Small school, private. Old money endowment, limestone buildings, a campus that looked like it had been designed to photograph well in autumn. The kind of place where the lawns were maintained by a grounds crew that outnumbered the philosophy department. I'd transferred in as a sophomore from a community college in Allentown because Whetstone had a molecular biology program that punched above its weight, largely due to one woman, Dr. Lena Ferraro, whose research in prion diseases had attracted enough NIH funding to build a new wing on the science building. I mention this because it matters. Everything about what happened to us traces back, in one way or another, to that funding and what it built beneath our feet without any of us knowing. The outbreak started on a Wednesday, October 15th. I remember the date because I had a midterm in biostatistics that morning that I'd barely studied for, and I was sitting in the second-floor lounge of Hargrove Hall at 6:40 a.m. trying to cram multivariate regression into my skull when my phone buzzed with a campus alert. Shelter in place, lock doors, avoid West Campus. No explanation. I assumed it was a gas leak, or maybe another bomb threat. We'd had a hoax call the previous spring, and I went back to studying. That was the last normal decision I ever made. By 7:15, the alerts were coming every 2 minutes. Avoid all outdoor spaces. Do not approach individuals exhibiting erratic behavior. Emergency services have been contacted. I walked to the window and looked out across the quad toward the Mercer Science Complex, and what I saw there ended my old life with the efficiency of a period at the end of a sentence. There were people on the ground, not protesting, not sleeping. Some of them were moving in ways that didn't look like movement so much as malfunction. Limbs working at angles that suggested the operating instructions had been scrambled. And there were others, standing or crouching over the ones on the ground, doing things I couldn't process from 200 yards away, but that my body understood before my mind did. Because I stepped back from the window and my hands were shaking, and I hadn't told them to shake. I won't describe the next 3 hours in full because they were chaos, and chaos resists narrative. What I can tell you is that I left Hargrove Hall at approximately 8 a.m. with 11 other people, students and one adjunct instructor named Phil Kessler, who taught freshman composition and who, it turned out, had done 2 tours in Iraq before getting his MFA, a fact none of us knew until that morning, when he took charge of our group with a calm authority that made the rest of us feel briefly like the world still had a structure. We moved south across campus toward the parking lots, because our plan, such as it was to get to cars and drive. That plan lasted 6 minutes. The parking lots were impassable. Not because of the infected, though they were there, but because everyone who'd had the same idea had created a gridlock so dense that cars were physically interlocked. Doors hanging open, engines still running, some with blood on the windshields. Phil redirected us east toward the athletic complex. We lost 2 people on that crossing. Marcus Beal, a junior I knew from organic chemistry lab, and a woman whose name I never learned, who had joined our group outside the library, and who fell behind when we sprinted across the service road and did not catch up. I heard sounds behind us that I will not describe. We made it to the field house and barricaded the doors with wrestling mats and a vending machine, and for about 90 minutes we thought we were safe. which tells you how little we understood about what safe meant in the new context. It was Phil who noticed the field house wasn't defensible. Too many entry points, glass doors along the east wall, a loading dock with a roll-up gate that didn't lock from the inside. He started talking about options, and most of us had none. But a woman named Dr. Yolanda Achebe, a postdoctoral researcher in Ferraro's lab, said something that changed the trajectory of every life in that room. She said, "There's a sub-level facility under Mercer, Ferraro's containment lab. It has its own air system and it seals from the inside." Nobody spoke for a few seconds. I remember Phil looking at her with the particular expression of someone evaluating whether information is trustworthy enough to bet lives on. Then he asked how she knew about it. And she explained that she'd been working in the upper floors of the Mercer complex for 18 months and had level 2 clearance to the basement research bays, but that below the basement there was a sub-level she'd only seen referenced in facility schematics during a fire safety briefing. She said Ferraro had mentioned it once, obliquely, calling it the downstairs, and that the single time Yolanda had asked about it directly, Ferraro had changed the subject with a firmness that communicated the conversation was over. We didn't deliberate long. The field house was already feeling permeable. We could hear sounds outside the loading dock that suggested the infected were accumulating nearby, drawn by the noise of our arrival. And the only alternative was the open campus. Phil asked Yolanda if she could get us in. She said she had a key card that accessed the Mercer basement. Below that, she didn't know. Phil looked at the rest of us. Nobody objected. We moved. Getting to Mercer cost us. The building was 400 yards east, across an open athletic field and a faculty parking lot. Phil made us wait until there was a gap in the visible movement. Then we ran in a loose group, staying low, not speaking. I was carrying a fire extinguisher I'd pulled off the wall in the field house, because it was the closest thing to a weapon I could find. And I remember the absurdity of that. Me, a biology student, running across a practice football field in the apocalypse, with a 10-pound red cylinder clutched against my chest like it could save me. It couldn't save me. But I held it anyway, because holding something felt better than holding nothing. We reached Mercer's east entrance. Yolanda's keycard worked. Inside, the building was dark. Power had failed or been cut. But the emergency lighting was on, casting everything in that amber-red glow that makes institutional hallways look like the corridors of a submarine. We passed through the ground floor quickly. I saw overturned chairs, a laptop on the floor with its screen cracked, a coffee mug sitting perfectly upright on a reception desk as though nothing had happened. The ordinary objects were worse than the broken ones. They implied that the transition from normal to catastrophic had been so fast that it outran the small, reflexive tidying that people do when they leave a space. The basement level was behind a security door that required Yolanda's card and a PIN. She entered both, and the lock disengaged with a heavy clunk. We filed through into a corridor that was noticeably different from the floors above. Lower ceiling, concrete walls, fluorescent tubes behind wire cages. Research labs lined both sides. Through the small windows in their doors, I could see equipment I recognized. PCR machines, centrifuges, biosafety cabinets, and equipment I didn't. At the end of the corridor, a freight elevator and a stairwell door marked Sub-Vevel, authorized personnel only. No keycard reader on this one. A biometric panel. Fingerprint. Yolanda pressed her thumb to it. Denied. She tried her index finger. Denied. She looked at Phil. He looked at the door. Then he looked at me and the fire extinguisher in my hands and said, "How much do you want to live, Ethan?" I understood. I swung the extinguisher at the biometric panel 3 times until it cracked away from the wall, exposing wiring behind it. Phil pulled the wires. Something clicked. The magnetic lock released. We descended a concrete stairwell, 2 flights, roughly 25 feet below the basement level. At the bottom, a steel door, thick, the kind you see in photographs of bank vaults or FEMA bunkers. It was ajar, not open but not sealed. Someone had left it unlocked, or someone had left in a hurry and hadn't closed it fully. Phil pushed it open and we entered, and what we found on the other side was not a research lab. It was a facility. I don't mean that in the casual sense. I mean it was a facility the way a military installation is a facility. Designed with a purpose that had nothing to do with the university above it. Built to a specification that exceeded anything academic research would require. The entry corridor was wide enough for a gurney. The walls were poured concrete, smooth, painted institutional gray. Every 20 feet, a heavy door with a porthole window and a pressure seal. Overhead, conduit and ventilation ductwork ran in organized channels, color-coded. Blue for air supply, red for exhaust, yellow for something I didn't recognize. The lighting was operational, powered by something independent of the campus grid, because the fluorescent tubes above us were bright and steady while the building overhead was dark. There were 9 of us by then. Phil Kessler, Dr. Yolanda Achebe, myself, a sophomore named Danny Reeves who had been in my study group and who hadn't spoken a word since we'd left Hargrove Hall, a campus security officer named Terrence Moody who had joined us at the field house and who had a sidearm he hadn't drawn. 2 students I knew only by first names, Priya and Soren, who were both graduate students in chemistry. A maintenance worker named Gil Betancourt, who'd been servicing the HVAC in the athletic complex when the alerts started. And a woman named Mei Ling Tsai, an associate professor of virology, whom we'd found locked inside a Mercer basement lab, alive and unhurt, who had been there since before dawn running assays and had not known anything was wrong until she heard us in the corridor. Mei Ling's presence mattered. She was the only one among us who had a professional framework for understanding what we might be dealing with. And when she walked through that sub-level door and saw the facility, her face did something I've never forgotten. It went still. Not afraid. Recognizing. The way you look when you see something you've suspected but hoped you were wrong about. And the confirmation doesn't bring relief, but a particular kind of dread that has weight and texture. Phil sealed the vault door behind us. Gil, who understood building systems better than anyone, found the environmental controls in the first room off the main corridor. A combination mechanical room and operations center with monitoring screens, most of them active, showing data I couldn't read. The air system was running. Temperature was 64 degrees, humidity 42%. There was a water supply, potable, according to Gil, fed from a dedicated well with UV filtration. And there was food, though not in the sense of a stocked pantry. There were cases of MREs stacked against a wall in what appeared to be a supply room, along with medical kits, flashlights, batteries, blankets, and 3 sealed containers of something labeled only with alphanumeric codes that Yolanda said she didn't recognize. We settled in. That first night, if you could call it night in a place with no windows and no clock other than our phones, which still showed time but had lost signal, we spread out across 4 rooms near the entrance and tried to rest. Phil posted himself by the vault door with Terrence and the sidearm. I lay on a concrete floor with a blanket that smelled like plastic and stared at a ceiling I couldn't see in the dark and listened to Danny Reeves breathing in the corner, fast and shallow, the sound of someone trying not to cry. I didn't sleep. I don't think anyone did. The next morning, if you could call it morning, we took inventory. The facility was larger than we'd initially grasped. The main corridor extended roughly 200 feet and branched into 3 lateral hallways. We mapped what we could access. The operations center, the supply room, a medical bay with examination tables and equipment still sealed in packaging. 2 dormitory-style rooms with cots, which meant the facility had been designed for habitation, which meant someone had anticipated people would need to live down here. A small kitchen with a water heater and microwave, but no stove. And a series of laboratories that were progressively more specialized as you moved deeper into the complex. The last 30 feet of the main corridor ended at a door that was different from the others. Heavier. Sealed not with a magnetic lock, but with mechanical bolts. 4 of them, driven into the frame from the inside. Through its porthole window, you could see another corridor, dimmer, with doors on both sides that had no windows. The air near that door was colder. Not significantly, maybe 3 or 4 degrees, but enough that you noticed it. Yolanda stood at that door for a long time on our first full day. She didn't touch it. She just looked through the porthole, and then looked at Mei Ling, and something passed between them that I couldn't interpret. We established a routine because Phil insisted on it. He said routine was the difference between a group and a mob, and he was right, though at the time it felt arbitrary. Morning check-in. Meal schedule. 2 MREs per person per day, which gave us roughly 3 weeks of food if we were strict. Water was less of a concern. The well system seemed robust. Gil monitored the environmental systems. Yolanda and Mei Ling began examining the laboratories, cataloging what they found. Phil and Terrence maintained security, which meant watching the vault door and conducting periodic walks of the perimeter. The rest of us helped where we could, which in practice meant we followed instructions and tried to keep our fear from becoming the dominant fact of our existence. It was on the 3rd day that things began to change. Mei Ling had been working in the 2nd laboratory, the one with the biosafety cabinets and the ultra-low temperature freezers, and she came to the operations center, where several of us were sitting, and said she needed to talk to the group. Her voice was controlled in a way that I associated with people delivering bad news in professional settings, the vocal equivalent of a pressed suit. She told us that the laboratory equipment in the sub-level facility was not consistent with prion research, which was the only funded program she was aware of under Dr. Ferraro's direction. The equipment was consistent with viral vector development, gain-of-function modification, and, she paused here, choosing her words, containment-grade pathogen handling. BSL-4 equivalent, the kind of work that required federal oversight, institutional review, and in most cases, explicit Pentagon or DARPA involvement. Phil asked her what that meant in plain English. Mei Ling said it meant someone in this facility had been working with dangerous pathogens at a level of containment that didn't match any disclosed program at the university. And the ultra-low freezers, 3 of them, all running, all locked with codes she didn't have, were maintaining samples at -80 degrees Celsius. Whatever was in them was being preserved, actively, right now, by a system that was still faithfully executing its instructions while the world above it came apart. Nobody said anything for a while. I remember the sound of the ventilation system, that constant low hum that was already becoming the background frequency of our lives. And I remember thinking that the air I was breathing had been filtered and recirculated by a machine that someone had installed specifically because the work being done down here required that the air going out be scrubbed of whatever was in it. That thought settled into me like a stone dropping into deep water. Soren asked if the outbreak could be connected to the lab. Mei Ling said she didn't have enough information to answer that, which was scientifically honest and emotionally useless. Yolanda, who had been quiet, said that Dr. Ferraro had been increasingly secretive in the past year, canceling lab meetings, restricting access to data, taking calls in her office with the door closed. She said she'd attributed it to the pressure of the grant cycle, but now she wasn't sure. Phil redirected the conversation to practicalities. Whatever the lab was or wasn't, we were inside it, and outside was worse. We would continue to gather information, and we would make decisions based on what we learned. In the meantime, the routine held. But the routine was already cracking. That night, Danny Reeves came to me and said he'd heard something. Not from above. We'd all heard sounds from above, muffled, transmitted through the structure of the building, groans and impacts that we tried not to interpret. But from deeper in the facility, from beyond the bolted door. He said it sounded like tapping, rhythmic, not mechanical. He said it sounded like someone knocking. I went with him to the end of the main corridor. We stood at the bolted door and listened. The facility's HVAC system made enough ambient noise that isolating specific sounds was difficult. But I stood there for 10 minutes, and in the 8th minute, I heard it. Not tapping exactly, more like a pressure change, a soft, repetitive thud, as though something on the other side of that door was pressing against it at intervals. I put my hand on the door. The steel was cold. I felt nothing through it, but the sound came again, and it was not the ventilation system, and it was not the building settling, and it was not my imagination, because Danny heard it too, and his face confirmed what my ears were telling me. We told Phil. He listened at the door himself. He heard it. He said nothing for a long time, then told us not to open that door under any circumstances, and posted Terrence outside it with instructions to log every sound he heard and the time he heard it. On the 4th day, Yolanda found the files. They were in a locked cabinet in the 3rd laboratory, the one farthest from the entrance, the one with equipment neither she nor Mei Ling could fully identify. Gil had forced the cabinet with a pry bar from the maintenance supplies. Inside, 3 binders of printed documents, 2 external hard drives, and a set of DVDs in paper sleeves, each labeled with a date and a project code. Promethean 7. Yolanda and Mei Ling spent the entire day reviewing the printed documents. The rest of us waited, because there was nothing else to do, and because the weight of not knowing was becoming harder to carry than the fear of knowing. When they finally gathered us in the operations center that evening, Mei Ling's composure had changed. She wasn't controlled anymore. She was angry. What she told us, and I'm reconstructing this from memory, so the technical details may not be perfectly accurate, but the substance is correct, was this. The sublevel facility had been operational for approximately 4 years. It was funded through a classified subcontract routed through a defense research intermediary, not through the university's normal grant structure. The principal investigator was Dr. Lena Ferraro. The project involved the development of a modified neurotropic virus, a pathogen engineered to cross the blood-brain barrier and selectively target specific neural circuits. The stated purpose, according to the documents, was the development of a behavioral incapacitation agent, a weapon, in other words, designed to disable enemy combatants by disrupting motor control and higher cognitive function without killing them. The documents described 3 years of animal trials, rodents, then primates. The results were characterized in the clinical language of researchers who had learned to describe horror with precision. Subjects exhibited progressive disinhibition, loss of threat avoidance behavior, compulsive approach and contact responses, and, in later trials, transmissible behavioral modification via fluid contact. The virus was contagious. It was designed to be contagious. That was the point. A weapon you only had to deploy once, because the targets would deploy it for you. The 3rd year of documents described containment breaches. 3 of them. Small. Controlled. Resolved through what the documents called terminal sterilization protocols, which Mei Ling said meant they killed everything in the affected area and autoclaved the remains. Each breach was attributed to procedural error. Each led to revised safety protocols. None were reported to the university, the NIH, or any civilian oversight body. The project's classified status was cited as the justification for internal handling. The fourth year of documents, the most recent, dated as recently as 6 weeks before the outbreak, described a new phase: human cell line testing. Not human trials, cell lines. Cultures derived from human neural tissue, maintained in the ultra-low freezers. The results of these tests were not included in the printed documents. They were referenced as being stored on the external hard drives, which were encrypted. When Mei Ling finished, the room was silent, in a way that had texture. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something heavy enough to suppress it. Phil was the first to speak. He asked whether the virus described in the documents matched what we were seeing on the surface. Mei Ling said the symptom profile was consistent: neurotropic targeting, behavioral disinhibition, loss of higher function, transmissibility through fluid contact. She said she couldn't confirm a match without sequencing, but the probability was not trivial. Soren asked the question that I think everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to voice. He asked whether the virus was in this facility right now. Whether we were sitting inside the thing that had ended the world. Mei Ling said the ultra-low freezers were sealed, and their containment integrity appeared intact based on the external indicators she could read. But she also said she didn't know what was behind the bolted door at the end of the corridor, and neither did the documents she'd found, because the documents described only the laboratory spaces we'd already accessed. Whatever lay beyond that door was referenced nowhere in the files. It was either added after the documents were produced, or it was classified at a level above what these binders contained. That night, the tapping from behind the bolted door was louder. I need to describe what happened to us psychologically, because the physical facts alone don't capture what it was like to live inside that knowledge. We were underground. We had no communication with the surface. Our phones were dead. And while the operations center had a communication panel, the antenna it connected to was presumably on the building above us, and we had no signal. We had food for approximately 2.5 more weeks. We had water. We had air. And we had the growing certainty that the air we were breathing, the walls we were touching, the floor we were sleeping on, had been built to house the thing that was killing everyone we'd ever known. The group began to fracture along a line I hadn't anticipated. I'd expected the split to be about whether to stay or leave. It wasn't. It was about the door. Priya and Soren wanted it opened. Their argument was scientific and, in its way, irrefutable. If the facility contained the source pathogen, and if that pathogen could be recovered and studied, then the information behind that door might be the only thing in the world that could lead to a treatment or a vaccine. The outbreak was days old. If there were other survivors, military, government, research institutions, they would need exactly what was locked behind that door. To leave it sealed was to prioritize our short-term safety over the long-term survival of the species. Phil wanted it sealed. His argument was tactical and equally irrefutable. We didn't know what was behind it. The sounds suggested something active, and opening it with 9 people and 1 sidearm in an enclosed underground space was a risk calculation with almost no upside and potentially infinite downside. If we died down here, the information died with us regardless. Mei Ling was torn. I could see it in her. The scientist in her wanted that door open with a hunger that was almost physical. The same hunger I recognized from my own training. The pull toward the unknown that had drawn me to biology in the first place. But the person in her The woman who'd been cataloging evidence of catastrophic institutional failure all day understood that the same impulse that created this facility, the drive to push into dangerous territory because the knowledge was too valuable to leave alone, was the impulse that had killed the world. Yolanda said almost nothing. She sat in the corner of the operations center and stared at the wall, and I could tell she was thinking about Ferraro, about the woman she'd worked under for 18 months, about what it meant that her mentor had been building this beneath their feet and smiling at lab meetings and reviewing her dissertation chapters, and all the while maintaining a secret that was, in the most literal sense, apocalyptic. Terrence kept his post at the door and logged the sounds. His notes, which I saw later, were meticulous. Timestamps, duration, character. 2214, 3 impacts, 1-second intervals, low frequency. Consistent with previous. He filled 4 pages in 2 days. Danny Reeves stopped eating on the 5th day. Not as a protest or a decision. He just stopped. I brought him an MRE, and he looked at it and then looked at me and said, "What's the point?" I didn't have a good answer. I said the point was that we were alive, and being alive required eating. And he said being alive in a place that had manufactured the end of the world wasn't being alive, it was being evidence. I didn't know what to say to that. I sat with him until he fell asleep, and then I went to the operations center and sat with my back against the wall and tried to figure out what I believed. Here's what I came to, and I want to be honest about the reasoning because it wasn't heroic. I didn't arrive at my position through moral clarity or scientific conviction. I arrived at it through fear. Specifically, through the recognition that I was more afraid of not knowing than I was of what I might find. The bolted door had become the organizing fact of our existence. Every conversation circled back to it. Every silence was filled by the sound of whatever was behind it. We were 9 people in a concrete box, and the box had a question embedded in its deepest wall. And the question was eating us faster than the MREs could sustain us. I decided I wanted the door open. Not because I was brave, because the alternative, sitting in that corridor for 2 more weeks, listening to that sound, imagining what made it, until the food ran out and we had to leave anyway, was a form of death that just hadn't finished yet. I told Phil. He heard me out. He didn't argue. He said, "If we open it and something comes through, I need you to understand that Terrence and I may not be able to stop it in a space this small." I said I understood. He said, "No, Ethan, you don't. Understanding is what happens after. Right now you're guessing." He was right. I was guessing. But I was guessing forward, which was the only direction that felt like it still had oxygen in it. On the 6th day, we voted. Phil insisted on it. He said if we were going to do something that could kill all of us, every person had to consent or dissent and have that recorded. Mei Ling suggested we each state our reasoning. Phil agreed. We went around the room. Priya, open. Scientific necessity and moral obligation to the larger population. Soren, open. Same reasoning, plus the argument that containment we didn't understand was more dangerous than containment we could evaluate. Mei Ling, open. Reluctantly. She said she couldn't justify leaving the door sealed when the knowledge behind it might matter more than their 9 lives. Yolanda, open. She said Ferraro owed the world an explanation, and this was the only place left to find one. Danny, abstain. He said he didn't care anymore. That shook the room. Gil, closed. He said he was a mechanic, not a scientist, and his job was to keep the systems running that kept us alive, and opening an unknown containment door in a bioweapons lab was the opposite of that. Terrence, closed. He said the sounds behind the door had changed in the last 24 hours, more frequent, more varied, and he'd started hearing what he described as vocalization. Not words, not moaning, something between. Phil, closed. He said the vote was a mistake because democracy didn't apply to demolitions, and opening a sealed door in a facility like this was demolition. Me, open. 5 to open, 3 to close, 1 abstain. Phil accepted the result with a stillness that I now understand was not calm, but the particular discipline of a man who has learned to execute decisions he disagrees with, because the alternative, loss of group cohesion, was worse than any single bad outcome. We prepared. Mei Ling and Yolanda suited up in the biosafety equipment they'd found in the third laboratory. Not full positive pressure suits, but Tyvek coveralls, N95 respirators, face shields, double gloves. Phil positioned Terrence at the door with the sidearm drawn. Gil stayed in the operations center, ready to activate the facility's emergency ventilation protocol, which he'd identified in the system controls, and which would, in theory, seal each section of the facility independently and vent contaminated air through the exhaust system's HEPA filters. The rest of us stood back. Phil unbolted the door himself. 4 bolts, each one requiring a half turn of a heavy steel handle. The sound of each bolt retracting was distinct and final, like the chambers of a revolver being emptied one at a time. When the last bolt cleared, he paused, listened. The sounds from the other side had stopped. Phil pulled the door open. The corridor beyond was lit, but dimly. A third of the overhead tubes were out, and the remaining ones flickered with the irregular rhythm of ballasts on the edge of failure. The air that came through the door was colder by at least 10 degrees and carried a smell I will try to describe accurately. Antiseptic, like the aggressive chemical clean of a hospital ward, layered over something organic that the antiseptic couldn't fully mask. Not rot, not decay. Something metabolic. The smell of biological processes continuing in a space designed to prevent them. There were 6 doors along the corridor, 3 on each side. Each was steel, sealed with the same mechanical bolt system as the door we'd just opened, each with a porthole window at head height. The portholes were dark, not unlit, dark, as though something had been applied to the interior of the glass to obscure it. On closer inspection, Mei Ling determined that the portholes had been painted over from the inside. Black paint, applied unevenly, with visible brush strokes. Someone had deliberately eliminated observation into those rooms. At the far end of the corridor, a 7th door, larger, unmarked. Phil signaled for us to hold position. He and Terrence moved down the corridor, checking each door. All bolted from the outside, all portholes painted. Phil pressed his ear against the first door on the left and held up a hand for silence. We waited. After 30 seconds, he moved to the next door. Same procedure. At the 3rd door on the right, he stopped. He didn't move his hand up. He didn't signal. He just stood there with his ear against the steel, and his body changed. Not dramatically, not the way it does in movies. His shoulders drew inward by a centimeter. His weight shifted backward onto his heels. Micro-adjustments. The geometry of a man preparing to move away from something quickly. He came back to us. His voice was low and even. He said there was something alive behind the 3rd door on the right. He said it was breathing. He said the breathing was wrong, too fast, too shallow, with a catch in it that sounded like something between a hiccup and a growl. He said we should close the outer door, re-bolt it, and never come back. Mei Ling asked if he'd heard anything behind the other doors. He said no. She asked if she could listen to the third door herself. Phil looked at her for a long time. Then he stepped aside. Mei Ling walked to the third door on the right. She listened. She listened for a long time, over a minute by my count. When she came back, her face had that same expression I'd seen on the first day, when she'd first entered the facility. Recognition. Dread with weight and texture. She said, "That's not infected behavior. The breathing pattern is distressed but organized. Whatever is in there is afraid." Terrence said maybe infected things could be afraid. Mei Ling said they couldn't. Not according to the project documents. The virus ablated the amygdala response. Fear was one of the first functions eliminated. Whatever was behind that door was either uninfected or was something the documents hadn't described. The argument that followed was the worst we'd had. Not the loudest, that came later, but the worst in the sense that it forced each of us to articulate what we valued more: safety or knowledge, caution or conscience. Because if something behind that door was alive and afraid, it was either a person or it was a test subject. And either way, leaving it sealed in a dark room in an underground facility beneath a university that no longer existed was a choice we would have to carry. Phil said carrying guilt was preferable to carrying a pathogen. Priya said we didn't know it was a pathogen. Soren said the bolts were on the outside, which meant whatever was in there had been locked in by someone who had the authority to lock it. Yolanda said Ferraro had that authority, and Ferraro had also built a bioweapon under a university, so her judgment didn't constitute grounds for deference. Danny said nothing. Gil said he'd like to remind everyone that the ventilation system connected all sections of the facility, and that if something aerosolized came out of those rooms, his emergency protocol might not contain it. Terrence said the thing behind the door was breathing faster now, and he thought it could hear us. The vote was closer this time. 4 to open. Priya, Soren, Mei Ling, me. 4 to keep sealed. Phil, Terrence, Gil, Yolanda, who had switched sides, saying she'd realized she wanted the door opened for revenge rather than knowledge, and that was the wrong reason. Danny abstained again. Tie. No action. We retreated to the main section and rebolted the outer door. That night, nobody slept. The sounds from behind the bolted door were different now. Not the tapping we'd heard before, but something more complex. Patterns. 3 then 2. 3 then 2. Over and over. When I mentioned it to Mei Ling in the morning, she went pale. "That's not random," she said. "That's sequential. Something in there is trying to communicate." I want to stop here and explain something about what it does to a person to live underground with a mystery that keeps escalating. On the surface, in normal life, you can turn away from things you don't understand. You can change the channel, close the browser, walk to a different room. Underground, in a sealed facility, with no exit that doesn't lead to something worse, you cannot turn away. The mystery is the room you're in. It's the air you're breathing. It's the hum of the machines that keep you alive. And every hour you spend not answering it, it answers a little more of you. It colonizes your thoughts. It restructures your priorities. It makes you into someone who will eventually open the door, not because you've decided it's the right thing to do, but because you can no longer tolerate being the person who didn't. Day 8. Yolanda cracked the encryption on one of the external hard drives. She'd been working on it quietly, without telling the group, using a workstation in the second laboratory that had processing power designed for genomic analysis. She said the encryption was government grade, but the password protocol was institutional, the kind that gets recycled across projects because the people who set it up prioritize convenience over security. She'd tried variations of Ferraro's known credentials and hit on the fourth attempt. What she found on the drive ended the debate about the door. The drive contained video files, dated, cataloged, lab footage from the sub-level facility's internal cameras. The most recent files were from 10 days before the outbreak. She called us in. Phil insisted on reviewing the footage alone first, with Mei Ling, before showing it to the group. They were in the second laboratory for 40 minutes. When they came out, Phil's face was unreadable in the way that frightened me more than any expression could have, because it meant what he'd seen required active concealment. He said we would watch the footage together. He said some of it was difficult. He said we needed to see it because it changed the tactical situation and he didn't have the right to make the next decision alone. The footage was time-stamped and organized chronologically. The earliest files showed what was clearly the construction phase of the sealed corridor. Workers in hard hats and Tyvek installing the heavy doors, running additional ventilation lines, bolting containment hardware into concrete walls. This was interior renovation, done inside the existing sublevel, expanding it. The workers wore no university identification. Their equipment was unmarked. The next set of files showed the rooms being outfitted. Each of the 6 rooms received a cot, a chemical toilet, a water line, an IV stand, and a wall-mounted camera. Each room received a ventilation connection with an independent filter housing. Each door received its bolt system and its porthole window. This was not laboratory space. This was holding. This was where you put people. The next set showed people being put there. 5 subjects. 3 men, 2 women. Ages difficult to determine, maybe 20s to 40s. They were brought in on gurneys, sedated, by personnel in full BSL-4 positive pressure suits. Each subject was placed in a separate room. IVs were established. The doors were bolted. The portholes were left clear. Over the following weeks, the footage was condensed, time-stamped entries rather than continuous recording. The subjects were observed, tested, sampled. Blood draws, neurological exams, cognitive assessments conducted through intercom. The subjects were conscious. They responded to questions. They asked questions of their own. One of the men, Subject 3, the files called him, asked repeatedly to call his mother. His requests were logged but not fulfilled. Then the inoculations began. One by one, each subject was injected with something the files identified only by the project code, Prom 7C. The footage showed the researchers entering the rooms in full containment gear, administering injections, withdrawing. The subjects were told they were receiving a vaccine trial. The consent forms, visible briefly in one frame, bore a Department of Defense header and a classification marking I didn't recognize. The progression took between 4 and 11 days, depending on the subject. The footage documented it with clinical thoroughness. Day 1, mild fever, confusion. Day 3, loss of fine motor control, speech disruption. Day 5, behavioral changes. Subject 2 began hitting the walls of her room rhythmically. Subject 4 stopped responding to verbal prompts entirely. Day 7, what the researcher's voiceover described as transition, which looked like a person forgetting how to be a person. The movements becoming less purposeful, more reflexive. The eyes losing the quality that distinguishes looking at something from merely facing it. By day 10, 3 of the 5 subjects had completed what the documents called full behavioral transition. They were, in every way that I recognized from what I'd seen on campus, infected. They moved like the people on the quad. They responded to sound and proximity. They pressed against their doors. The other 2 subjects, Subject 3, the man who'd wanted to call his mother, and Subject 5, one of the women, did not fully transition. The footage showed them in their rooms, clearly ill, clearly changed, but still exhibiting what the researchers described as residual executive function. They could orient to stimuli deliberately. They could manipulate objects. Subject 3 was observed using his blanket to block the camera in his room. Subject 5 painted over her porthole window with a substance the researchers identified as a mixture of her own blood and the antiseptic solution from the wall-mounted dispenser in her room. That was the black paint we'd seen. Not paint. Something worse. The final footage was from 9 days before the outbreak. It showed Ferraro, visible for the first time, identifiable by her university ID badge, standing in the sealed corridor, looking through the porthole of Subject 3's room. She was alone. She was not in containment gear. She was speaking, but the audio was poor, the words indistinct except for one phrase that Mei Ling asked Yolanda to replay 3 times. "I'm sorry. It wasn't supposed to cross." The video ended. The drive contained no more files after that date. We sat in the laboratory, and the silence was the kind that builds pressure behind your eardrums. What we now knew was this. 5 human beings had been deliberately infected with an engineered pathogen in the rooms behind the bolted door. 3 had become fully infected. 2 had partially resisted, retaining some cognitive function. Ferraro's final recorded words suggested a containment failure. It wasn't supposed to cross, implying the pathogen had escaped the facility, which meant the global outbreak was not a natural event, not a mutation, not an accident of nature. It was this lab. It was these rooms. It was the woman whose name was on the building's dedication plaque. And at least one of the partially resistant subjects was still alive behind that door, tapping in patterns, breathing with fear, painting over their window to hide, trying to communicate with the only cognitively meaningful signal available. 3, then 2, 3, then 2, knock, 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 knock. Priya pointed out quietly that 3-2 was SOS in a simplified form. 3 of anything, then 2, repeated. A universal distress pattern. Not Morse code exactly, but close enough. Close enough that it could only come from a mind that still remembered what distress was and still believed someone might respond. Phil stood up and left the room. I found him in the corridor outside the operations center, leaning against the wall with his eyes closed. I'd never seen him show anything that could be interpreted as distress. He'd been the architecture of our survival, load-bearing. And you don't think about the stress on load-bearing structures until they start to crack. He opened his eyes when I approached and said, "I was in Fallujah in 2004. I saw what people do to other people when they have authorization and a closed room. I thought I'd left that behind. I didn't know what to say. I said I was sorry. He said, 'Don't be sorry, be correct.' He said the situation had changed and his previous position was wrong. And being wrong when the stakes were this high wasn't something you got to hedge or delay on. He said we were going to open the door. Not because it was safe, because what was behind it was a person. And leaving a person locked in a dark room because you were afraid of them was the thing that had built this facility in the first place. And he would not be another version of that. We opened the door on the morning of day 9. The full group assembled in the sealed corridor. Phil and Terrence went first, Terrence with the sidearm, Phil with a length of steel pipe he'd detached from a decommissioned fixture in the mechanical room. Mei Ling and Yolanda followed in their biosafety gear. I stood behind them. The others waited at the outer door, ready to seal it if Phil gave the order. We started with the rooms that the footage suggested held the fully transitioned subjects. Phil unbolted the first door on the left and opened it slowly while Terrence covered the interior. The room was empty. The cot was overturned. The IV stand was on the floor. The chemical toilet had been knocked from its mounting. On the wall, scratch marks, deep ones, gouged into the painted concrete by fingernails or something harder. But no subject. The room was vacant. The second room. Same. Empty. Disturbed. Signs of prolonged, undirected physical activity. The mattress shredded. The water line pulled from the wall. The floor stained with fluids I didn't want to identify. But no body. The third room on the left, the last one on that side, was different. There was a body. It was on the cot, positioned with a deliberateness that contrasted with the chaos of the other rooms. Lying on its back, arms at its sides, covered with the thin institutional blanket up to the chin. The face was visible. Male, middle-aged, eyes closed. Skin with the particular pallor that communicates the absolute cessation of biological function. He had been dead for some time. There were no visible wounds. On the wall above the cot, written in what appeared to be the same blood and antiseptic mixture, were 3 words. "Let me out." The writing was deliberate. The letters were formed carefully. Whoever wrote them had enough cognitive function to spell, to compose a message, to leave a record. This was Subject 3, or Subject 5, one of the partial resistors. And they were dead. Not from the virus, at least not directly. Mei Ling examined the body briefly and said she couldn't determine cause of death without an autopsy, but noted the absence of traumatic injury and the positioning of the body, which suggested the subject had lain down deliberately. She said it was possible that the partial resistance had been temporary, that cognitive function had eroded slowly rather than catastrophically, and the subject had died during or after that final decline. Or the subject had simply stopped eating and drinking, which, in a locked room with no human contact, was not difficult to understand. We moved to the right side of the corridor. First door, empty. Signs of the same undirected violence. Second door, empty. Third door, the one Phil had listened at, the one with the breathing, was bolted. Phil positioned himself. Terrence aimed. Phil unbolted the door, pulled it open. The room was dim. The overhead tube was out, and the only light came from a small emergency fixture near the ceiling that cast a faint blue-white glow. The cot was intact. The water line was functional. I could see a slow drip from the fixture where it connected to the wall. The chemical toilet was in its place. The IV stand was upright, but the IV bag was empty and had been empty for some time. In the far corner, pressed into the angle where the 2 walls met, sitting on the floor with her knees drawn up and her arms wrapped around them, was a woman. She was thin, not starved but diminished, the way someone looks when they've been consuming just enough water to survive and nothing else. Her hair was dark, matted, hanging past her shoulders. She was wearing the remains of what had been a hospital gown. Her feet were bare. Her skin had the same pallor as the dead man's, but underneath it, there was something else. A faint mottling, a network of visible capillaries at her temples and along her forearms that gave her a bruised appearance. She was looking at us, not facing us, looking. Her eyes tracked Phil as he entered the room. They moved to Terrence and the gun. They moved to Mei Ling. They moved to me. There was something behind those eyes that I recognized because I'd seen it in every member of our group over the past 9 days. It was exhaustion. The particular kind that comes not from physical effort, but from sustained cognitive resistance against something trying to take your mind apart. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The woman's breathing was audible, fast, shallow, the pattern Phil had described. Her hands were trembling. Her mouth moved, and for a moment no sound came out, just the motion of lips and jaw working against a resistance that seemed partly physical and partly something else. Then she spoke. How long? Her voice was rough, damaged, the vocal quality of someone who had not used speech in a sustained way for weeks or longer. But the words were words. The syntax was syntax. The question was a question. Mei Ling stepped forward. She was shaking. I could see it through the Tyvek, but her voice was steady when she answered. You've been in here for at least 3 weeks, probably longer. We're survivors from the university. Can you tell me your name? The woman's eyes closed. Her mouth worked again. When she opened her eyes, something had shifted. Not a loss, but a gathering, as though she was pulling scattered resources into a central location. Nora, she said. Nora Landry. I'm Subject 5. What followed was the most important conversation of my life, and I will try to reproduce it accurately despite the fact that my hands are unsteady as I type this, even now, even with months of distance. Mei Ling asked Nora what she could remember. Nora spoke slowly, with frequent pauses that I initially attributed to weakness, but came to understand were something more specific. She was filtering. She was sorting, in real time, between thoughts that were hers and thoughts that were intrusions from whatever the virus was doing inside her nervous system. She described it, later, as the difference between hearing your own voice and hearing a voice that uses your mouth. She said the virus didn't silence you. It didn't replace you. It built a second set of instructions on top of yours and made them louder. And your job, if you were one of the ones who could still hear the difference, was to keep choosing the quieter voice. She told us she had been recruited through a veterans medical study program. She'd served in the Army, military police, 4 years, honorable discharge. The recruitment materials described a clinical trial for a neuroprotective therapy. She'd signed forms she now understood were fraudulent. She'd been transported to the facility blindfolded, which she'd been told was a security protocol for the university's biodefense work. She hadn't questioned it, because she'd spent 4 years in an institution that used security protocols to justify everything, and the habit of compliance was deeper than the instinct to resist. She told us about the inoculation, about the days after, about watching her own cognition change from the inside. Like watching a tide come in across a beach you're standing on, she said. Except the beach is your ability to think, and the tide is something that wants to think for you. She said Subject 3, the man in the room across the corridor, the one who was dead now, had maintained function longer than her at first, but had deteriorated faster once the decline began. She said he'd written the message on the wall during his last coherent period. She said she'd heard him stop moving 3 days later and known what it meant. She told us about Ferraro. Ferraro had come to her room alone, near the end, near what Nora now understood was the breach that started the outbreak. Ferraro had been distraught, not performatively, genuinely. She'd told Nora that a containment failure had occurred during the disposal of biological waste from the animal trials, a procedural shortcut taken by a technician who had been cycling samples to an off-site incinerator through the university's standard waste stream rather than the classified protocol. The virus had reached the surface. Ferraro said she was going to alert the administration. She said she was going to shut the project down. She said she was sorry. Then she'd left. And she hadn't come back. And the lights in the corridor had stayed on. But no one had come to feed the subjects, or check the IVs, or run the assessments. And one by one, the sounds from the other rooms had changed, and then stopped. And Nora had been alone in the dark. Her overhead light had failed on what she estimated was the 3rd day after Ferraro's visit. With nothing but water from the wall fixture, and the sound of her own breathing, and the constant, grinding effort of choosing her own thoughts over the ones the virus was trying to install. She'd tapped on the door because she'd heard us. She'd tapped 3-2 because it was the simplest pattern she could think of that a human being would recognize as intentional. She said the virus didn't understand patterns. It understood stimulus and response, approach and contact, but it didn't understand sequence or symbol. She said the fact that she could still use a pattern was the proof she held on to every hour. The evidence that she was still in there. Still her. Still Nora. Phil knelt down in front of her. He didn't touch her. He said, "Nora, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Are you safe to be around?" She looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. I don't think she had the hydration for tears. She said, "Most of the time. There are moments when the other thing gets closer. I feel it like a pressure behind my eyes. When it comes, I can't guarantee anything. But it hasn't won yet." Phil nodded. He looked at Mei Ling. Mei Ling said they needed to get Nora to the medical bay, rehydrate her, assess her condition. Phil agreed. He and I helped Nora to her feet. She weighed almost nothing. She leaned against me as we walked her down the corridor, past the rooms where her fellow subjects had either escaped, died, or been transformed, and through the bolted door into the section of the facility we'd made into our home. The rest of the group reacted the way people react when the thing they've been fearing turns out to be the thing that needs their help, with a disorientation that took different forms in different people. Danny Reeves looked at Nora and started eating again that night. I don't know why. I don't think he knew why. But something about seeing a person who had been imprisoned and abandoned and infected, and who was still fighting to remain herself, made his question, "What's the point?" answerable in a way that no argument from me had managed. Priya and Soren helped Mei Ling with Nora's medical assessment. Her vitals were poor but stable. Severely dehydrated, malnourished, tachycardic, with a low-grade fever that Mei Ling said was consistent with an ongoing immune response. Her neurological exam was mixed. Cognitive function largely intact, but with deficits in short-term memory and processing speed, and involuntary motor behaviors. A hand tremor, a repetitive head movement, that Mei Ling said were consistent with subcortical viral activity. The virus was in her. It was active. It was not winning, but it had not lost. The question of what to do with this information, with Nora herself, with the research files, with the knowledge of the lab's connection to the outbreak, became the question that defined our remaining days underground. Mei Ling argued that Nora was, as far as they could determine, the only known case of sustained partial resistance to the virus. Her survival was not just a personal triumph. It was a biological data set. Her blood, her cerebrospinal fluid, her neural activity patterns, these were the starting materials for understanding why some people could resist the virus and how that resistance might be amplified or replicated. If there was going to be a treatment, a vaccine, a future in which humanity did something other than die or become the thing that killed it, Nora's biology was the foundation. This meant two things. First, they needed to collect and preserve as many samples as possible, using the laboratory equipment that was still functional. Mei Ling and Yolanda could do this. They had the training and the tools. Second, those samples and the research files needed to reach someone who could use them. A surviving research institution, a military medical facility, a government remnant with laboratory capacity. Which meant someone had to leave. Not someone. Some of us. Maybe all of us. Our food supply was down to 11 days. The water system was still functioning, but Gil had identified a bearing failure in the recirculation pump that he estimated would become critical within 2 weeks. The air filtration was on a 6-month maintenance cycle, according to the documentation he'd found. and the last logged maintenance was 4 months ago, which meant we had weeks, not months, before the filters degraded enough to matter. The facility that had saved us was beginning to show us the same truth every shelter eventually reveals. It was a loan, not a gift, and the terms were coming due. Mei Ling and Yolanda worked for 3 days straight. They drew blood from Nora, carefully, because she had little to spare, and processed it through the centrifuge and the PCR equipment and the sequencing arrays that had been set up, ironically, to monitor the virus's progression in the subjects it was meant to destroy. They isolated viral particles. They mapped antibody responses. They documented neural activity using an EEG unit they found in the medical bay, still in its original packaging, apparently purchased for the project but never deployed. The data they generated filled 2 external hard drives and a stack of printed readouts that Mei Ling organized with the meticulous urgency of someone building an ark out of paper. During those 3 days, I spent most of my time with Nora, not because anyone assigned me to her, because she asked. She said my voice was the right pitch, low enough to be grounding, steady enough to give her something to hold on to when the other thing pushed close. I sat with her in the medical bay while Mei Ling took samples, and I sat with her in the dormitory room where we'd set up a cot for her. And I talked. I talked about nothing important, because she said important things were harder to process and sometimes triggered the intrusion. The virus seemed to activate in response to emotional arousal, which meant strong feelings were dangerous for her in a way that I found almost unbearably cruel. So I talked about my classes, my roommate's obsession with competitive disc golf, the dining hall's persistent inability to make edible rice, the time I'd accidentally submitted a lab report with the header still reading, "Title goes here, dummy," and my professor had docked me 3 points specifically for the word dummy. She laughed at that. The laugh was strange. It started normally and then caught, stuttered, as though the machinery that produced it had a hitch in its gearing. She noticed me noticing and said, "It does that." The laugh is one of the harder things to hold on to. The virus doesn't understand laughter. It doesn't understand anything that doesn't serve approach or consumption. So when I laugh, it tries to route the impulse somewhere else. I have to fight it back into being a laugh. Every time. I asked her what it felt like from the inside. The virus, the resistance, the daily act of choosing herself. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Imagine you wake up and there's someone else in your house. They don't talk to you. They don't negotiate. They just start rearranging the furniture. Slowly. One piece at a time. And you put it back, and they move it again, and you put it back. And this goes on all day, every day, and you can't leave, and they can't leave, and the house is your mind, and the furniture is every thought you've ever had about who you are. And some days you're stronger than them, and some days they get a piece into a position you can't undo, and you learn to live with the table in the wrong place, because the alternative is exhausting yourself, fighting for something that doesn't matter as much as the things you still need to protect." I asked what she still protected, what she spent her energy on. "Names," she said. "My name, my mother's name, my dog's name. The feeling of knowing that other people exist and that I was one of them. The virus doesn't care about names. It doesn't need them. And so that's where I live, in the things it doesn't bother to take because it doesn't understand their value." On the 11th day, Gil came to Phil with the news we'd been anticipating. The recirculation pump was failing. He'd managed a temporary repair using gasket material from the maintenance supplies, but the fix was measured in days, not weeks. When the pump failed, the air system would continue to draw from the dedicated well, but the pressurization that kept the facility's atmosphere isolated from the building above, the same pressurization that prevented whatever was in the upper levels from seeping down, would drop to 0. We would be breathing the same air as whatever was in the Mercer Science Complex above us. And we knew what was in the Mercer Science Complex. Phil called what he said would be our last group meeting. He laid out the situation with the directness that had defined him since the beginning. We had food for 7 more days. The water pump had 2 to 5 days. The air seal had roughly the same window. We could not stay. He said the question was not whether to leave, but how and where. Mei Ling presented the scientific case. The samples and data they'd compiled were, potentially, the most important biological materials on the planet. They needed to reach a functioning laboratory. She said she'd been able, using the facility's communication panel and a frequency scanner Gil had rigged, to detect a faint military broadcast repeating on an emergency channel. The broadcast identified a FEMA coordination center at Fort Indiantown Gap, approximately 90 miles northeast. The broadcast was automated. It repeated on a loop with no variation. So there was no way to know if the facility was still operational. But it was the only signal they'd found. Phil outlined 2 options. Option 1. The entire group moves together, carrying the samples and data, heading for Fort Indiantown Gap overland. Advantages: collective security, shared load, combined skills. Disadvantages: speed, noise, visibility, and the fact that Nora's condition made sustained physical exertion unpredictable. Mei Ling had observed that elevated heart rate and stress hormones worsened the viral intrusion, meaning exertion could push Nora closer to the threshold she'd been fighting to stay above. Option 2. The group splits. A fast team carries the data and moves for the military installation at maximum speed. A slower team moves with Nora at whatever pace she can sustain, heading for the same destination on a different route. Advantages: the data has the best chance of arriving. Disadvantages: divided resources, separated people, the possibility that one or both groups doesn't make it. We discussed it. It was not a clean discussion. Danny, who had been eating again, and who had become, in the days since Nora's rescue, something closer to the person he might have been before all this, quiet but present, observant, useful, said he would stay with Nora. He said it simply, without drama, as though it were obvious. Priya and Soren volunteered for the fast team. Gil said he was too old and too heavy to move fast and would go with the slow group. Terrence said he would go where Phil went. Yolanda said she needed to be with the data because she was the only person other than Mei Ling who understood the file structure well enough to explain it. Mei Ling said she was staying with Nora. Phil started to argue. Mei Ling cut him off. She said the samples were preserved and documented, and that any competent virologist could interpret the data with the notes she'd prepared. But Nora herself, the living, breathing, fighting example of partial resistance, was irreplaceable and irreproducible. And if Nora deteriorated on the road, the only person who could manage that deterioration was someone who understood the virus at the molecular level. She said she hadn't spent 3 days studying Nora's biology to hand her off to people who couldn't read her warning signs. She said this was not heroism. It was triage. The data was important. Nora was more important. Phil accepted it. He accepted everything that morning, with the economy of a man who had learned that argument spends time you don't have. We left the facility on the morning of day 13. The departure was procedural. Phil had drilled us on movement formation, hand signals, noise discipline, and the protocol for encountering infected in different terrain types. We exited through the sublevel stairwell, through the Mercer basement, and up into the ground floor of the building, which was daylit for the first time in nearly 2 weeks of artificial light. And the sun coming through the broken windows hit my eyes with a physical force that made me stagger. The campus was unrecognizable. Not destroyed. That would have implied an active force of demolition. It was abandoned in the way that living things abandon a body after death. The structure was intact, but the animating principle was gone. Leaves had accumulated on the walkways. A bicycle was locked to a rack, with its front wheel still spinning in the wind, which meant the wind was the only thing on campus that still moved with purpose. We could see figures in the distance, on the quad, near the library, moving with the distinctive gait that I had learned to identify at range. But none were close. Phil split us at the east edge of campus. The fast team, Phil, Terrence, Priya, Soren, Yolanda, carrying the hard drives and printed data in waterproofed packs, would move northeast along the rail corridor that ran past the university, using the tree line for cover, traveling light and fast. The slow team, me, Mei Ling, Nora, Danny, Gil, would wait 2 hours, then move north through the residential streets to the creek drainage that Gil said would give us a low-visibility corridor heading generally northeast. Phil shook my hand. He said, "Get her there, Ethan." He didn't specify whether he meant Nora or Mei Ling. I think he meant both. I think he meant everyone. Then he turned and moved out, and within 3 minutes, his group was gone behind the tree line, and I was standing in the pale October sun with 4 people looking at me as though I had a plan. I didn't have a plan. I had a direction and a destination and a rough understanding of the terrain between here and there, cobbled together from Gil's knowledge of the regional geography and a campus map we'd found in Mercer's ground floor lobby that showed the surrounding area in enough detail to identify major roads and waterways. 90 miles. With a woman whose nervous system was at war with itself, a maintenance worker with bad knees, a student who'd been catatonic a week ago, and a virologist who weighed 120 pounds and was carrying a medical kit that weighed 30. We moved out 2 hours after Phil's group, as planned. The residential streets were worse than the campus because they were intimate. These were places where people had lived, and the evidence of interrupted lives was everywhere. A garden hose still running, pooling water across a sidewalk. A child's bicycle on its side in a driveway. A front door open, screen door swinging in the breeze, the interior dark. We moved quietly, in single file, Gil on point because he knew the town, me at the rear because Phil had told me the rear position was the one that required the most discipline. The temptation was to keep looking back, and looking back slowed you down and split your attention at the moment you could least afford it. Nora walked in the middle, between Mei Ling and Danny. She moved carefully, each step deliberate, and I realized she was managing her exertion the way a diabetic manages blood sugar, constantly monitoring, constantly adjusting. She kept one hand on Danny's shoulder, not for balance but for contact. She'd told me in the facility that physical touch from another person helped. It gave the virus less room, she said, because the sensation of another human being's presence was so fundamentally social, so deeply encoded in the neural architecture the virus couldn't fully rewrite, that it functioned like a wall the intrusion couldn't easily cross. We reached the creek drainage by noon. Gil found the path he'd described, a maintenance access trail that followed the waterway northeast through a wooded corridor between residential developments. The tree cover was good. The ground was uneven but passable. We saw no infected for the first 3 hours, which I attributed to the fact that the drainage was low ground, below sight lines, and the water noise masked our movement. In the 4th hour, Nora stopped walking. She stopped without warning, without stumbling, without any external cause. She simply halted, her hand tightening on Danny's shoulder hard enough that he winced. Mei Ling was at her side immediately. Nora's eyes were open but unfocused. Not vacant the way the infected's eyes were vacant, but turned inward, seeing something internal, fighting something internal. Her jaw was clenched. The tremor in her hands was worse, both hands now, And not just tremor, but a rhythmic opening and closing of the fingers that looked involuntary. Mei Ling took Nora's face in both hands and said her name. Said it clearly, firmly, the way you'd call someone who was sleepwalking. Nora. Nora Landry. You're with us. You're outside. My name is Mei Ling. You're walking to safety. Your name is Nora. The episode lasted 90 seconds. When it broke, Nora gasped. A sharp, wrenching intake of air, the sound of someone surfacing. And her eyes refocused and found Mei Ling's face, and she said, I'm here. I'm still here. She was shaking badly enough that Danny had to hold her upright. Mei Ling checked her pulse, rapid, over 120, and her pupils, which were unequal in size, the left larger than the right. We rested for 20 minutes. Mei Ling administered an anti-inflammatory from the medical kit and made Nora drink water. She told me, out of Nora's hearing, that the episode was consistent with what she'd been afraid of. The exertion was feeding the virus, giving it metabolic energy to push harder against Nora's defenses. She said they needed to slow down. She said if we pushed too hard, the quiet war inside Nora's skull could tip. And if it tipped, there would be no warning and no reversal. I recalculated. 90 miles at our current pace, with rest stops, would take 6 to 8 days. That assumed no obstacles, no infected encounters, no further episodes. It assumed our food, 8 MREs split 5 ways, would last. It assumed Gil's knees would hold. It assumed a lot. We covered 9 miles the first day and camped in a culvert under a county road. Gil took first watch. I took second. During my watch, in the deep middle of the night, I sat at the mouth of the culvert and looked at the sky and saw stars, the first I'd seen in 2 weeks. And their indifference was, paradoxically, the most comforting thing I'd encountered since the outbreak began. They didn't care. They didn't know. The universe was not watching what happened to us, and there was a freedom in that, a release from the sense that our suffering was being observed, or evaluated, or weighed against some cosmic standard. We were on our own. We had always been on our own. The difference was that now we knew it. And knowing it made the choices we made feel more real, more ours, because there was no audience to perform for and no judge to appeal to. Just the dark and the water and the people sleeping behind me, and the woman among them whose mind was a battlefield, and who woke every morning and chose, again, to be herself. Over the next 5 days, we moved northeast through a landscape that was simultaneously familiar and alien. The infrastructure of rural Pennsylvania, its roads, its farms, its small towns, was intact but emptied. We passed through places where the evidence suggested organized evacuation. Cars gone, houses locked, no signs of violence. And we passed through places where the evidence suggested the opposite. Vehicles abandoned mid-road, doors broken inward, dark stains on porches and sidewalks that we stepped around without speaking. The infected were present, but sparse in the rural areas. Drawn, Mei Ling theorized, toward population centers where the density of stimulus kept them aggregated. In the open country between towns, we moved through a stillness that felt almost peaceful, if you didn't think about what had produced it. Nora had 2 more episodes. The second, on day 3 of travel, was shorter, 40 seconds, and she recovered quickly. The third, on day 5, was worse. She went rigid. Her eyes rolled back, and for 10 seconds she made a sound that I cannot write and will not try to reproduce, except to say that it was not her voice. It was the other thing using her vocal cords, and hearing it come from the mouth of someone I had come to care about was the closest I have ever been to understanding what it means to witness a person being occupied against their will. When she came back, she cried. The first time I'd seen her cry. And she said, "It's getting closer. The wall is thinner." Mei Ling adjusted the medication. She reduced our pace further. She told me privately that she estimated Nora had days, not weeks, before the resistance could no longer hold. She said the journey was killing her, not the distance but the stress, the constant neurochemical assault of fear and exertion that the virus exploited the way fire exploits wind. On the 6th day of travel, day 19 since the outbreak, day 13 since we'd entered the sub-level facility, we found the FEMA Coordination Center at Fort Indiantown Gap. Or rather, we found what was left of it. The installation was real. The broadcast was real. The facility was a repurposed National Guard training base with concrete buildings, fenced perimeter, and a radio tower that was still transmitting the automated loop we'd heard in the facility. But the base was not operational, in the sense that implied living, functioning humans. The gates were open. The guard posts were empty. There were vehicles in the motor pool, some with doors ajar. The building showed signs of hasty departure. Papers scattered, equipment left running, personal effects abandoned. We entered cautiously. Gil and I searched the main administrative building while Danny stayed with Nora and Mei Ling in a supply depot we'd found unlocked. The administrative building was empty of people, living or otherwise. In the communications center, the automated broadcast equipment was running on generator power. A diesel unit in a shed behind the building, still chugging with a fuel tank that read 1/4 full. The broadcast was a recording, set to repeat. Nobody had been there to update it or replace it for what appeared to be several days at minimum. But the communications center had something else, a functioning long-range radio. Not the automated system, but a separate unit, military grade, with a handset and a frequency selector and a logbook beside it that showed entries dated as recently as 4 days before our arrival. The last entry read, "Relocated to Raven Rock, Convoy 0600, all remaining personnel. God help us." Raven Rock. I knew that name. Everyone who'd ever read a thriller novel or watched a documentary about government continuity knew that name. Site R. The underground Pentagon, a facility built inside a mountain in southern Pennsylvania, designed to survive nuclear war. If there was a functioning government, if there was a command structure, a scientific apparatus, a military remnant with the resources to use what we were carrying, it was there. I went back to the supply depot and told the others. Gil studied the logbook and the maps we found in the operations center and estimated Raven Rock was 50 miles south. A long way, but the base had vehicles and fuel. He found a Humvee with a full tank and a functioning engine. Danny found food, a pallet of MREs in a warehouse that could sustain us for weeks. Mei Ling found, in the base's medical building, a refrigeration unit where she could properly store the biological samples she'd been carrying in an insulated pack with rapidly diminishing cold packs. We spent one night at Fort Indiantown Gap. It was the first night we'd slept inside a building since leaving the sub-level facility. The walls felt wrong. Too thin, too penetrable, after days of poured concrete and steel doors. I slept poorly. In my dreams, I was back in the sealed corridor, looking through the porthole of Nora's room, and the glass was painted black, but I could hear her breathing. And I wanted to open the door, but my hands wouldn't move, and someone behind me was saying, "It wasn't supposed to cross," in a voice that I knew but couldn't place. I woke before dawn. Nora was sitting on the edge of her cot, looking at the wall. I sat down beside her. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, "I can feel it adapting." I asked what she meant. She said the virus was learning. Not in the way a mind learns, it had no mind, but in the way a river learns the shape of a canyon. It was finding new routes around her defenses. Strategies that had worked for weeks were becoming less effective. She said it used to push hardest when she was afraid or tired, but now it was pushing during calm moments too. Probing, testing, looking for the gap between one thought and the next. She said she was losing ground not in dramatic collapses, but in millimeters, and the millimeters were adding up. She said, "You need to know that I might not make it to wherever we're going as myself. And if I don't, if the wall comes down, you can't hesitate. Mei Ling will know. She'll see it in my eyes before I do anything. And when she tells you, you have to act. Not for your safety, for mine. Because the thing I'm afraid of isn't dying. It's being alive in there while it uses me. Do you understand?" I said I understood. She looked at me, and I think she saw that I was lying. That I understood the words, but not the reality. Because the reality was a thing you couldn't understand until you were inside it. She nodded anyway. She put her hand on mine, briefly, and the touch was warm and human and alive. And the virus that was in her blood and in her brain did not prevent her from being kind. And I have held on to that fact ever since, as evidence that whatever this pathogen was, whatever it had been designed to do, it had not accounted for the full depth of what it was trying to overwrite. We drove south the next morning. Gil at the wheel of the Humvee, Danny riding shotgun, Mei Ling and Nora in the back seat, me in the cargo area with the samples and data and a rifle we'd found in the base armory that I had never fired and hoped I would not have to fire. The roads were passable. Rural highways, 2 lanes, mostly clear except for the occasional abandoned vehicle that Gil navigated around with the patience of a man who had spent his career solving mechanical problems, one step at a time. We saw infected. More than we'd seen in the rural stretch north of the base. Small groups mostly, standing in fields or along roadsides, with the vacant stillness that characterized their resting state. They tracked the Humvee as it passed, heads turning, bodies orienting, but they didn't pursue. Mei Ling said vehicle noise was confusing to them. The virus calibrated its approach behaviors to biological signatures, breathing, heartbeat, body heat, and the mechanical stimulus of an engine didn't trigger the same response. 40 miles in, we hit a blockade. Not infected. Human. A barricade of vehicles across the highway, manned by 3 people in civilian clothes with hunting rifles. They signaled us to stop. Gil slowed. Danny reached for the rifle between the seats. I told him to wait. The people at the barricade were scared. You could see it in their posture, in the way they held their weapons. Too tight, too close to the body. The grip of people who had never expected to point a gun at another human being, and were doing it anyway because the world had contracted to a set of choices that no longer included comfortable ones. Their leader, a man in his 50s with a feed cap and a Remington 700, approached the Humvee and asked who we were and where we were going. Gil told him. The man said Raven Rock was real. He'd heard the broadcasts, but he'd also heard that the military had locked it down and wasn't admitting civilians. He said there was a convoy of survivors that had tried to reach it 3 days ago and been turned away at the perimeter. Mei Ling leaned forward from the back seat and said we weren't civilians. She said we were carrying biological data from the facility that had originated the outbreak. She said the data included samples from a partially resistant subject and genomic analysis that could form the basis for a countermeasure. She said if the military at Raven Rock was serious about surviving this rather than just outlasting it, they needed what was in the back of our vehicle more than they needed another Humvee of refugees. The man looked at her for a long time. Then he moved the barricade. We reached the Raven Rock perimeter at dusk, It was exactly what I'd expected and nothing like what I'd imagined. A mountain. A road that led into the mountain. A gate. Razor wire. Concrete barriers. Guard posts that were manned, actually manned, with soldiers in uniform, the first military personnel we'd seen since the outbreak. Floodlights. Generators running. The infrastructure of a government that had retreated underground and pulled the door shut behind it. We were stopped at the outer checkpoint. Soldiers approached with weapons drawn. Gil killed the engine. We raised our hands. I felt the weight of every mile behind us. The sub-level facility, the sealed corridor, the bolted doors, Nora's room, the campus, the drainage ditch, the culvert, the empty towns, the broadcast that nobody was sending anymore. All of it pressing down on my shoulders as I sat in the back of a Humvee with my hands up, trying to communicate through body language alone that we were not a threat. Mei Ling did the talking. She identified herself. She identified the university and the sub-level facility. She said the words Promethean 7, and I watched the face of the officer she was speaking to change. Not a lot, not dramatically, but enough. He knew the name. He stepped away and spoke into a radio. We waited. 20 minutes. 30. 40. Nora was silent in the back seat, conserving herself, her eyes closed, her hands folded in her lap. Danny sat beside her, steady and watchful. The person he'd become since the day we'd opened her door, and he'd found his reason to eat. A new officer appeared, higher rank, colonel's eagles on his collar. He spoke to Mei Ling briefly, then asked to see the data. She handed him the hard drives and the printed files through the window. He looked at them. He looked at us. He looked at Nora. He spoke into his radio again. They let us in. I'm going to end here, because what happened inside Raven Rock is its own story, and it's not the one I was asked to tell. What I will say is this. Mei Ling's data reached a laboratory. The samples were viable. Within a week of our arrival, a team of military virologists had confirmed what Mei Ling and Yolanda had documented. That Nora's partial resistance was not random, but was rooted in a specific immune response that could, in theory, be replicated. I don't know how far that research has gone. I don't have clearance, and the people who do don't share. Nora is alive. She is still herself, as of the last time I saw her, which was 11 days ago. She is in a medical ward inside the mountain, monitored constantly, treated with an experimental protocol that Mei Ling helped design. The episodes are less frequent. The wall, she says, is holding. She says it some days with confidence, and some days with the particular caution of someone who knows that confidence itself can be a gap the enemy enters through. Phil's team arrived at Raven Rock 6 days after we did. All 5 of them intact. Phil walked through the gate, saw me standing there, and said, "You got her here." I said I had. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. I think about the sub-level facility every day. I think about who built it and why, and what they told themselves while they were doing it. I think about Ferraro, who I never met alive and who has not been found among the living or the dead. I think about the consent forms with the Department of Defense header. I think about Subject 3, who wanted to call his mother, and who died alone in a locked room, with 3 words on the wall that nobody read in time. I think about the 5 people who were told they were receiving a vaccine trial and were instead given the end of the world in a syringe. I think about the fact that the virus was designed, that someone sat in a meeting and approved it, that funding was allocated and progress reports were filed and milestones were celebrated, and at no point in that process did the machinery of oversight, the review boards, the classification officers, the university administration, stop it. The system didn't fail. The system performed exactly as designed. It kept the secret. It contained the information. It prevented interference. And then a technician cut a corner on waste disposal, and the most precisely engineered containment in the facility's history was undone by the most mundane human behavior imaginable. Someone taking a shortcut because the proper procedure was inconvenient. That's what I can't stop thinking about. Not the virus, not the infected, not the sound of Nora's breathing in that dark room, or the words on Subject 3's wall. The shortcut. The small, ordinary, utterly human decision that proved the entire apparatus of secrecy and containment and classified protocols was only ever as strong as the weakest, most tired, most careless person inside it. We didn't fall to a monster. We fell to a misfiled bag of biological waste and the institutional architecture that made misfiling it possible. The monster came after. The fall came first. My name is Ethan Walker. I was a fourth-year molecular biology student at Whetstone University. I am now something else, something I don't have a word for yet. Something that lives inside a mountain and wonders every day whether the data we carried out of that lab will matter enough to justify the cost of obtaining it. I don't know the answer. I don't think I'll know in my lifetime. But I know this. Nora Landry is alive, and she is fighting, and the thing inside her has not won. And every day that remains true is a day the people who built that lab and signed those forms and approved that project did not get the final word. That's not hope. I don't trade in hope anymore. It's just a fact. And facts, unlike hope, don't require your belief to remain true.